Good evening and welcome everyone to another episode of Tech for Good Pills. So Tech for Good Pills is a series of interviews with the founders and practitioners from the Tech for Good space that wants to bring together the Tech for Good community, really bringing these guests as protagonists in our series, asking them to share their experience and the best practices they've learned along the journey for the benefit of everyone else in the Tech for Good community. The series is organized by Nest Italia and started in 2021 and runs every 2 weeks on our channels. So whether you're following us from YouTube or from Facebook, you're welcome to. You're free to ask questions using the comment section on the platform, because I will ask some questions to our guest tonight, but we will be very happy to also answer the questions that you may have. So before introducing our guests, just a couple of words of logistics. So the interview will run for approximately 20-30 minutes. There will be some initial questions from me, but then, as I said, I will be very happy to take your questions as well. But let's start with our guest tonight. Here with us we have Dhruv Gulati, who is the founder and CEO of Factmata. So welcome, Dhruv.
Hi.
So let's kick off. So Dhruv, at Factmata, you're using AI to preserve the quality of the internet, and what you want to do is really to empower everyone with a better understanding of content. So this is, a very ambitious goal and a very tough challenge that you're working on, which is something that is very, very current in this current environment. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the problem you're solving and how you're tackling it at the Factmata?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me along. Super excited to kind of talk about our journey building a Tech for Good company. So to answer your question, kind of what is Factmata? What are we trying to do? So I think you alluded to kind of our mission statement, which is to give everyone a better understanding of online content. I think the realization of the problem, obviously, first of all, came from looking at find ourselves in right now. So for example, obviously we know about the fake news issue online. We know about the misinformation problem online, disinformation, state actors getting involved in effectively trying to take down governments via narrative manipulation. We've seen problems around fake news and how certain conspiracies are being spread. We've seen agenda-driven publications that pander to certain governments to try and essentially not form a free press. So all these problems have really exacerbated themselves in the last kind of few years. But then the realization that a tool like Factmata must exist is that the core problem in terms of our solutions to solve these things is that we don't have a good understanding of online content. So the technology to actually be able to assess, classify, filter, cluster, categorize what is being said online needs to have a machine in place because there's just too much content to sift through. And the current systems to analyze online content are essentially things that, for example, track keywords or they track sentiment analysis, and they tell you that, the conversation about COVID-19 is getting very positive or it's very negative, and these are the keywords that are appearing. So vaccines are appearing more often than school reopening. But this is not very helpful to actually be able to detect a lot of things that you need to be able to detect. So for example, is a government under attack? Are there conspiracies that are spreading? What is the level of propaganda? What is the level of hate speech? What's the level of bot generated content? Once you're able to track these things, you can actually start to do something about the problem. For example, build better algorithm systems, or have fact checkers check things, or have moderation systems that can take down this bad content. But if you can't detect it, or you don't even know how bad the situation is, you won't be able to do anything about it. So I think Factmata was basically built with this mission of getting us to a better understanding of online content using machines, so that then we can start to take some action on some of these problems.
And can you tell us more about what content you focus on? Because I think for our audience, content can mean anything, I guess, from social media posts to newspaper articles. What do you look at?
Yeah, so we kind of focus on basically text content. So what sort of is, let's say it's a tweet or a news article, we'll be analyzing purely pieces of text. And then how we built our system is, and the reason we focus on text is that when you often see misinformation, a good example would be an article that, let's say, uses certain phrases or certain words, or puts things in a certain order, or describes one individual in a very negative way and another individual in a very positive way, or frames a situation or a scenario in a context where it's omitting certain facts, or it's promoting a certain fact versus something else. So these are all examples of where you have text which is clearly just biased or forming misinformation. Now, there are other forms of misinformation that we do not deal with. So, for example, we do not deal with deepfake manipulation, where you have videos that are altered. We don't deal with images alteration. So we don't have systems that can, for example, look at when pixels have been adjusted, or a new object has been placed in an image to show, for example, that an airplane came from a certain location when it wasn't from that location, or to add that there was a plane crash somewhere when there wasn't a plane crash. There's a lot of examples of image manipulation that we don't find. So we focus more on how can we find probabilistically, so just giving some signals as to when an article is more biased than what is neutral.
Okay, so you mentioned articles and also social media content, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So articles, social media content, and we try and go cross-platform. So one of the key problems that also we've tried to solve with our technology is that most systems to analyze online content focus very well on analyzing, let's say, social media tweets, but they're not very good at analyzing long-form articles. So because the types of ways that people describe events or describe key news issues on articles is different to social media tweets. It's different discourse structure. So and the other key thing is that a piece of fake news can start on Twitter, but then it could move into a news article, and then the news article could then be repasted on Reddit, and then the Reddit post could then start a Telegram discussion. So you need to have a system that's able to track how a piece of fake news kind of propagates through these different platforms.
Okay, wow. And you mentioned that obviously with to tackle such a difficult technical undertaking, you have to rely on machines and intelligence to do that. But one interesting aspect about your approach is that to analyze these news and social media narratives, that you don't only use machine learning and advanced natural language processing, but also you combine it with expert networks, with the input from civil society organizations. So can you tell us a little bit about this approach, why you do it, and why it's important?
Yeah. So I think when we started with this approach, we kind of realized that unlike most machine learning problems, where essentially there is a right answer. So for example, if I give you a machine learning problem that says, can you classify this image as a dog or a cat? There's no middle ground. It's either a dog or it's a cat. So it's very easy for someone to there's a right or wrong answer. And the other aspect about this problem is that really anyone can do it. Most people, even who are not so educated, or even probably younger people, everyone kind of knows what a dog or a cat is. But if I asked you to classify an article as, let's say, is it an example of manipulated content? Or can you tell me if this article that you're reading has gender bias? Can you tell me if this article is omitting key context? It's a very difficult question to ask, and the person who's answering this question and labeling the content to help the machine learning system needs to be quite smart. They need to be able to understand the context. They need to be able to understand the news article, what's happening in the news, the history of the event. They need to be able to categorize and put that specific article in context, and to an extent know about the subject. So, for example, if I asked you to label a scientific article and say, is this correct or not? You need to understand the science and be able to have read some academic papers to know that this is probably not the right way of presenting the science. So we knew from the beginning that we needed to get expert people to label the data. The final reason why we need the experts to label the data is, even if we built the best algorithms possible, we knew that someone will ask, well, who trained the system? And even though any system is biased, we thought actually it'd be better to get people who we could sort of rely on as being experts to have trained the system, so we can audit. And when we explain to people how our system was built, they know exactly which types of groups have been involved in labeling. So if I have a classifier system for medical misinformation, it's trustworthy in the sense that we know the types of universities that were involved, the types of student profile that was annotating the data, what expertise each person kind of had who was labeling each piece of content.
Okay, and obviously this this will open questions about the qualification that these people have, but we'll go there in a second. But I think before we move any further, I think you gave us a very good picture of the size of the problem and your approach. Can you tell us a little bit about who is using Factmata?
Yeah.
And because I think that will bring it to life very much.
Sure. So in terms of kind of misinformation, disinformation, the types of actors that are involved, you can kind of split them into, I'd say the key players really are like the media world. So this is right from people who create media, so social media platforms, news publishers. Then you have the advertising world, who places ads on the media. So these are kind of like the demand side platforms, supply side platforms, ad exchanges, ad networks. And that's a really complex other field, programmatic advertising. And then you have the brands in the media world. So they're the ones who create the adverts and place the ads on the media using these intermediaries. The second type of component of people who are involved in this space or are affected by misinformation, disinformation are governments. So there's big governments, defense organizations, cybersecurity organizations that are worried about threats around disinformation. And you call them information security. So people who are basically manipulating information to try and create some false piece of information that forces someone to give their account details, or is threatening to a business and going to destroy their business because there's a huge amount of manipulation that's trying to take down their stock price, something like this, more of a cybersecurity threat. And then the final person who's affected is obviously the consumer, right? The consumer wants to know if what they're reading can be trusted. Factmata's use case and who we sell to is actually two types of use case that we found is very effective. One of them is advertising networks. So these are networks that essentially take in lots of websites, and these websites are part of the ad network because they want to make money on the ad network. So they've created a website, they add the tag of the ad network on their code, and this is saying, I would like to join your ad network and I want to earn some money from the ad network. And sometimes the ad networks don't want these new websites to join them because they're propaganda, they're spreading conspiracies, they're spreading pseudoscience, they're bad for the health of the network. So we've been selling our solution to a lot of these advertising networks to clean up the inventory of sites and pages. The second type of user for us is actually large communications agencies So strategic communications agencies who might represent governments, they might represent organizations that are worried about manipulation and fake news and disinformation about their brand or their company. So, for example, there are a lot of PR agencies who are representing, the WHO or the UN or Amnesty International, and these PR agencies want to make sure that there's no fake news about those organizations that might harm their reputation in the long run or be misrepresenting facts about these organizations. So we can help them find that fake news about them.
Okay, thank you, Dhruv. And at this point of the interview, I always ask our guests to share something that they have learned through their journey that they believe other founders, other practitioners in the tech for good space can leverage in their journey. Maybe something that you think is transferable as a skill or maybe as a best practice. We call this series Tech for Good Pills because we want to find these gems, these pills.
Yeah, I'd say for my journey as a Tech for Good founder is that I think one of the things that we've been quite good at, I'd say, is being very focused on commercialization of the product right from the start and thinking through different markets and business models and things like this. Because I see a lot of Tech for Good founders essentially kind of focusing on the mission that they're trying to achieve and kind of the path from an impact perspective that they're trying to have without thinking about, if they're not able to be profitable, or if they're not able to fund or sustain the project, essentially they won't have any impact because the product will just shut down in a year or two. So I think thinking about sustainability from the get-go is really, really important. And I'd say one second thing, and we've definitely kind of made design choices that are ethical, is actually stick to your guns, right? So if you start the company and you have certain ethical criteria and you have certain best practices and you build a design framework around your ethics, make sure that you adhere by that, and that's repeated through your organization, so that they understand why certain decisions are being made, even though the engineers may want to build something else because it's faster, or they might want to build something else because they think it's just going to work quickly and we can get it out there. Even though we know so your role as a founder is to make sure that the team is not just shipping things for the sake of it, but they know what questions they should be asking before they put something out there.
Yes, and I think one question that comes to mind when you're describing this, that you start the journey as a founder, very impact driven, and you started Factmata for a reason, because to solve this mission and to solve this big problem. Yeah, you mentioned, but of course there could be the many different forces pulling you in all directions, and there could be the technical team potentially shipping something for the sake of shipping it, and this is more an internal battle to keep the mission alive all the time. But I'm sure there can also be some more economic forces that are potentially pulling you away from your initial vision, because after all, Factmata is a for-profit organization, and as you mentioned, you have clients. So what are your thoughts on this balance, and how do you maintain purpose as a founder?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always seen kind of business as a way of achieving huge amounts of impact. If you look at what Tesla has done to the world of climate change, you could argue that they've had more of an impact than all of the different think tanks and organizations that have been thinking about it, because they've actually taken some action on it, and people buy the product, and the product has led to serious behavior change that then you can probably tie to impact metrics, and they also make a lot of money for their shareholders. So I think I've always seen business as a route to kind of achieving impact. I've also seen, before starting Factmata, how charities, organizations, impact organizations operate, and often the risk I've seen is that a lot of those organizations, they kind of talk about impact and they think a lot about it, but they don't have the funds necessary to achieve that impact, and the sustainability required to go beyond donations. So even for Factmata, for example, if you see, we wrote sort of a plan from the beginning. The plan for Factmata was actually to make sure that we were profitable from the beginning as quickly as possible. So as in, we are able to sustain the business. Maybe it's making $1 million or $2 million a year. And that we think would be enough to be able to then reinvest all of the profits into developing what we think would have a lot more public impact, which is our consumer platforms. So our goal was to first go to sell to businesses who can fund the impact and fund the problem. And then once we had those businesses paying for the solution, go and distribute that to the public. It's kind of like how Tesla thought about solving this problem. They would first sell a very expensive car to very rich people, and that would then allow them to develop the technology to then make it more public and more open source and available cheaper to everyone, and then achieve the larger impact that they were trying to have.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense, and everything is fitting now into our roadmap towards your mission. But in the meantime, there has been a question on YouTube, so I'll read it out. So this is coming from Sarah, who's following us on YouTube, and Sarah says, "How do you deal with the subjectivity of interpretation?" And the example she makes is that gender bias, for example, is identified differently and depending on the people you ask. So this is, I think it is a very tough one that I'm sure comes up very often.
Yeah. So I think if you're there's a lot of work that's being done in machine learning around interpretable models, and it's an entire field that has evolved particularly rapidly in the last 2-3 years, where previously we were using deep learning systems to just classify and give you an answer that says, this is gender biased, this article. But the next question is why? And so there's different categories of how you could explain to a user how the system came about its decision. So one simple thing is to highlight, for example, the most important words in the paragraph or the sentence that caused it to be most gender biased, the system to be. Then you can highlight where the system itself might be biased, because maybe it's picking up the word rape or something like that or something like this as a triggering word, when actually that's not very intelligent. Then we move the field to kind of explaining the phrases that cause the classification. So if it's a long article, you can highlight the entire sentence and give it different shades of red or green to show which ones contributed to the classification. I think what that's more of a machine learning technical solution to the problem. The way that we thought about kind of having people trust what we do is our test data, so the way that we're evaluating our system to be accurate or not, is available publicly. So you could just email us if you wanted, and we tell you like how we evaluate the accuracy of our models, and it will be about 1,000 rows of data, so you can see the gold standard labels, that we've generated that says this or that is gender biased or not, and you can audit how we've got that training data or the test data. Then we thought about, okay, well, what sort of communities would be the right people to label something as gender biased or not? It's a very, very tricky problem, because if you think about something like labeling medical misinformation, you could argue that some scientists in that specific field of research would be the best experts. But with gender bias, it's kind of like, are you asking a woman to label a female to label something that about that's pro women? Are you asking like, how are you kind of dealing with something that's talking about transgender issues? Are you trying to get someone who's a charity or an advocacy group for transgender people to label that content? I think there's no right answer to this. I guess the way that we thought about it is to basically make sure that our thought process around picking the labelers is as clear to people as possible, and we can provide very clear metrics around who labeled the data. Funnily enough, this doesn't actually exist in any system that you see. So if you were to tell me, if you were to ask Facebook, who labeled the newsfeed algorithm, they've probably forgotten who's labeled it, or it's not stored somewhere, or it's anonymized, or it's they've lost all the characteristics of it. So this is actually a pretty new thing to actually say, well, look, let's actually make sure we track our experiments and make sure that we can actually track who's labeling the data. There's no real panacea, but it's more about actually we can tell you who's labeled that gender bias algorithm.
Okay, yeah, and by creating this transparency, you can be kept accountable by the people using the solution.
Yeah, we're fine if we get it wrong. We will just improve it from there. But as long as we're, people can audit it, it creates that element of trust.
Okay, and I think we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you a question about the vision, achieving the vision for Factmata. So you mentioned that you started serving some clients, and eventually you want to bring this solution to really empower the public with a better understanding of content. How do you see that happening?
So our vision is we actually started to, probably too early on, build a social media platform back in 2018. But obviously to sell to businesses and build a social media platform is too much to do for a small company. Essentially, it's kind of what I was describing with the Tesla use case is a good example, right? So let's say I sell a system to a large government agency that wants to track misinformation around COVID-19, which we are doing. And let's say I sell that system, and using this work with this agency, the feedback that the agency gives me, them using the system every day, the product will get better. It will get better from feedback. Soon it will become so scalable and so easy to use that actually there's no reason why a member of the public might not want to read a news bulletin that says, here's what's happening about COVID-19, just like they pick up the New York Times, or they pick up their Feedly news aggregator, or they go on Twitter. Why can't we also build a news generation service, but where actually the news isn't created by us? We're just summarizing what other people are saying into a clear way that people can summarize. We can display to people what, here are the key facts, here are the key opinions, here are the ones we think are false, here are the ones we think are more credible, here are the key experts involved, kind of providing a summary of a meta layer on top of news. And so that's kind of like one thing that we are really excited about kind of launching. Probably not this year, but definitely near the end of this year, we'll be starting to think about that.
Okay, that's really exciting. I think it sounds like the killer solution to getting a very rich set of information to really make up your mind about what's really going on in the world.
Yeah. The news is just a filter right now, right? So people are reliant on maybe 30 to 100 journalists at the BBC to write something that summarizes all of the original content. If you can make the original content very accessible and digestible to the reader, you're kind of cutting out the news organization and the biases potentially that they would have in curating it or adjusting it or framing it in a certain way, and allowing the reader to be able to do that framing themselves.
Okay. Well, Dhruv, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and thank you so much for sharing, these learnings that you have gathered through your journey with Factmata, and best of luck for the future.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. So I think we've come to the end of our interview today. It's been amazing having Dhruv from Factmata with us tonight, and check out our new appointments with the Tech for Good pills. And see you back here in 2 weeks' time. Good evening, everyone.
Thanks.